coming in to ask for Stimulus Act money. This is something that I think has been a little disingenuous by the administration. They said, well, lobbyists can't come in, but they can file something written. But the problem is that big corporate executives can come in. And so really, and none of those meetings will actually be disclosed. So meetings or discussions with lobbyists will be disclosed. These meetings with corporate titans won't be. We're actually going to have less disclosure, not more. And we think that's a problem. In addition, we're just shifting the lobbying. Rather than an actual registered lobbyist being the person who comes in, the person in the firm who isn't a registered lobbyist comes in and asks for the Recovery Act funds. So that's one of the things we've been plugging away at. Another thing we're working on right now is to make sure that records are being preserved throughout the administration. One of the problems that we've seen is that records management is the laws have not kept up with the technology. And so things like electronic records are just not properly managed across the administration, and they're just gaping holes. The National Archives and Records Administration is just not doing its job, and we're working to see that they are that they change their laws and they change their oversight and act much more aggressively to improve the maintenance of records. Another thing that we're working on that I think is important is the problem of veterans returning home with post-traumatic stress disorder. We've seen a couple of instances now where first the VA and now the Army are refusing to diagnose veterans with PTSD because it's too expensive, and they want to diagnose cost adjustment disorder instead. So we're working both to push Congress to investigate this and to gather documents to prove that this is happening. You told us you have about a $3 million a year budget, 13 people working for your organization. You've been in business for about 6 years. 6 years. How long are you going to stay with it? You know, that's hard to say. It's a lot of work, and it is hard to always be the one telling everybody else they're doing the wrong thing. Sometimes you'd like to be a little more positive, and that was, I think, part of the reason we did the ethics training, for example, to try and be more positive. But I think it's important that groups like CREW are around and focused on these kind of issues, because I think it's the only way we're going to be able to keep politicians honest. I'm looking at your board of directors. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, including you. The chairman, Daniel Berger? No, Luis Mayberg. Luis Mayberg. Why? Who is Luis Mayberg? Luis Mayberg is the head of a mutual fund in Maryland called Pro Funds, and he is one of the initial founders of CREW, and he is a nonpartisan guy, very independent, but just thought that there was a real problem with congressional ethics. He ran into some problems with bank regulators back in the 80s during the whole savings and loan crisis, and he thought people behaved dishonestly and disingenuously depending on who their campaign contributors were, and it's just been an important issue to him. And when did he get into this? Well, he helped found CREW back in 2003. Although it's interesting, we actually started talking about CREW in August of 2001 or July of 2001, and then after September 11th, we tabled the discussion for a while. Who is Daniel Berger? Daniel Berger is a trial lawyer in Philadelphia, and he's been involved with the organization since its early days as well. So how did you meet him? I met him through Luis Mayberg and Norm Eisen, who knew him. Erwin Chemerinsky. Chemerinsky, who is he? Mr. Chemerinsky, Professor Chemerinsky, is a leading constitutional law professor. We're so excited to be able to work with him, and he is now the dean of a new law school out at the University of Southern California. I'm sorry, at UCLA at Irvine, the first new law school in decades. And we met him through our work on the Wilson case. He consults with us and helps us in the lawsuit. We represent Joe and Valerie Wilson in their case against Scooter Libby, the former Vice President Cheney, and Karl Rove. You represented them? Yes, we do still represent them. Legally? Legally. How does that work? They're our client. We currently have asked, their case was dismissed at the district court level, and that was upheld by the Court of Appeals. We have a petition for certiorari with the Supreme Court, which Professor Chemerinsky wrote for us, and we're waiting to see if the Supreme Court will take the case. So do you operate as a law firm then? We have represented clients before, so yes, in that respect, we have, in addition to the work you and I have talked about on congressional ethics, CREW has at least 12 lawsuits going on at any given time. What are some of the others? We have a lawsuit, as I said, regarding the Office of Administration regarding the missing White House emails. That's the White House Technology Office. We have a lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security over visitor records, whether people who visit the White House, whether those are agency records, which are subject to the Freedom of Information Act, or whether they are presidential records and can be kept secret. We've been winning in the court on that, and so far it looks like those are going to turn out to be public public accessible records.
When you were an assistant U.S. attorney, did you appear in court?
Very regularly.
Now, do you do it on some of these cases?
I have I've appeared in court only once where we handled a criminal matter for somebody, but generally speaking, our chief counsel, Ann Wiseman, has done most of the court appearances.
Craig Kaplan is a member of your board. Who is he?
He's a lawyer in New York.
And how did he get on this board?
He's involved in lots of progressive organizations and progressive causes, and I met him, and he expressed a lot of interest in Crew's work, and he's also worked with a lot of nonprofits, so he's great at advising us on how we can best meet our fiduciary obligations as a nonprofit.
One more, John Luongo.
John Luongo is a venture capitalist out in Southern California. Again, he's very involved in a lot of progressive causes, and that was how I met him.
Now, there's so many organizations in town. How do you differentiate what you do from all the other? We just talked about some of the others, and we haven't even talked about some of the conservative organizations.
Right. Well, Crew was started because we thought that there was really a gap not being filled, a gap that there was no organization using the legal system to aggressively target unethical conduct, and that's what we came in to do. We have specific legal tools that we try to use to go after unethical members, and that can be a Freedom of Information Act request, or we file IRS complaints, we file complaints with the Federal Election Commission, we file complaints with the Department of Justice. But everything has a legal angle. We look for the legal hook to expose the unethical conduct. That's really, I think, the main difference between what we do and what so many other good government organizations do, as terrific as they are.
Do you feel you're competing for money a lot with other organizations?
Well, I think in this environment, particularly now that there's this financial turndown, every organization is competing for money, and it's always an issue. You're always worried about where your next dollar is going to come from, and are you going to be able to stay in business. But I think that our donors like our more aggressive approach, that we are so out there on a day-to-day basis fighting for these things. Not just, we engage in educational campaigns, but we don't just try to educate. We really try and see if we can find a legal hook to push our issues hard.
Who are some of the biggest donors you have, and is there a restriction on how much money they can give you?
We don't have any restriction, but I would say our biggest donors are, for example, the Open Society Institute is a very big donor.
And whose organization is that?
Well, it's a foundation, but it's well known to be George Soros is the one who funds it. The Wallace Global Fund gives us money. The ARCA Foundation gives us money. Those are some of the big foundations where Carnegie Corporation gives us money.
You do see a thread through the different sides in this, where a big donor like George Soros will give to an awful lot of progressive organizations. Does he ever ask for anything directly?
No, and I have met him, and he's never asked for anything at all. And I meet with the program officer from the Open Society Institute, and they're very happy with what we do, and they're very keen on transparency. We're part of their democracy program.
How often does somebody call you at your desk and say, I want you to go after somebody?
Do you mean a donor or just a regular person, or?
Probably a donor, somebody that is invested in what you're doing, and they say, that guy you ought to go after him.
I would say it's pretty rare. Somebody may call me and say, are you aware of X? And we may look into it, and then we'll make a judgment on whether or not we'll go after X or Y person. But we have, I can say absolutely assuredly, we've never taken on any particular member of Congress or other political figure because somebody asked us to. It was always our judgment that it was the best.
How political a person do you consider yourself now, and do you look toward the opportunity of getting back in government someday?
I consider myself much less political now than I used to be. I was once obviously a Democrat. I worked for 3 different Democrats on the Hill. Both I worked for Senator Biden before I worked for Chuck Schumer when he was on the Hill, and then John Conyers. And I would say doing this kind of work has made me much more of an independent. I've realized that neither party has a lock on ethics. You can see party problems on both sides. And now really I just like members who are independent and ethical and believe in the values that I do.
If you could do anything you could do to bring better ethics into this town, what would you do?
I think everything else we do is really tinkering around the edges until there's real meaningful campaign finance reform. The fact of the matter is members of Congress need money, the people who are going to, in order to run for re-election, and the way they're going to get that money is mostly from lobbyists who want something from them. Until we break that link between the campaign contributions and the legislation, everything else is simply tinkering around the edges.
When you look at the figures, it turns out in the top 10 or so, you've got maybe 6 of them are unions. And I've never heard you mention